All right, good afternoon. Introduction seems a little silly, but we'll do it anyways. I'm Paul Manoguerra. I'm the Chief Curator and Curator of American Art here at the Georgia Museum of Art. The Education Department asks the curators, as we approach getting ready to plan the next quarterly calendar, to do these tours in two. And they really leave it open to the topics. And obviously, often we choose to do a tour or two for one of the special temporary exhibitions. But for this one, I decided I would do a tour to a brief tour. I think will be about half an hour by the time it's all said and done, on a topic that I had been wanting to just spend some time on in conversation with visitors. And that was on a single painting in this gallery, which is by Charles Bird King, and it's a portrait of William Harris Crawford. I thought we would just spend time giving context to that one painting. Rather than also, I have some images that I've taken, and as well as some other images that provide context. And rather than use my iPad to do that, we elected to then go ahead and just bring the screen in here and project them a little bit bigger. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. So the one painting that we're going to focus on is this painting here. The artist is Charles Bird King. The sitter is William Harris Crawford. But we're not going to begin here. We're going to initially shift and take a look at the painting down in this direction on the very far wall. Because I'm going to expose to you one of the many curatorial conceits in the Radford Gallery. And one of those is that we have juxtaposed mentor, teacher, with student, who then becomes mentor, teacher, juxtaposed with the next student. So in fact, we have multiple generations of artists teaching each other, all in the Radford Gallery. And the forefather of all of those connections is the artist for the painting that's the initial painting that you encounter when you come into Radford Gallery. That artist, this man, his name is Benjamin West. Now, West is an American, but if you were to ask Benjamin West to his dying day if he were an American, he would have probably held out for the fact that he was still an Englishman. But he was born in Springfield, Pennsylvania, a little Quaker community in colonial Pennsylvania. And because of that, American art historians like me claim him as an American in spite of whatever his wishes might have been. So West was born in Pennsylvania, began studying art in Philadelphia. And of course, being colonial America, there were no great art schools in the United States in colonial America. And he knew to make it as a professional artist, he needed to travel to Europe. And at the end of the 18th century, what that meant was making sure that you ended up in Rome, in Italy. Yes, ma'am.
His dates.
I can give you his dates because I don't remember off the top of my head.
Okay.
But Benjamin West was born in 1738. He passed away in London in 1820.
Okay, fine.
So as a young artist, seeking his artistic education, he goes to Rome as the part of the neoclassical romantic movement at the end of the 18th century, the mid-part of the 18th century, really. In Rome, he goes to see the great ancient and Renaissance sites, to see ancient classical sculpture, to study anatomy from those ancient sculptures, but as well as Renaissance sculpture. And he does that as part of his artistic education. But as he's going from site to site to site in Rome, he becomes a tourist attraction. As a tourist, he becomes a tourist attraction himself. No Italian, no Roman had ever seen a person born in the New World. So of course Italians had wild, fanciful ideas of what they would expect. And Benjamin West played into those ideas a little bit. As he was going, for example, to the Vatican, he went to go study the Apollo Belvedere, the great sculpture in the Vatican. And tradition holds that he records that he made a comment about the Apollo Belvedere, the Roman marble copy of the lost bronze Greek original, saying, "How like a Mohawk warrior," in reference to Apollo. And of course, the Italians latched on to that idea instantly. And so as he was traveling, visiting the Forum, visiting the Colosseum, he had bands of Italians, of Romans, following him, simply gawking at the New World America. He was a sight in his own right. as he traveled around. He ends up back in London, works on gaining commissions, in particular portrait commissions, but in fact, through Sir Joshua Reynolds, eventually ends up as official history painter to King George III. And he gains that title in the late 1760s. That job, those commissions, those royal commissions, freed him up to continue working on portraits and earning a little bit of extra income from portraits. And that's about the same time period as our portrait here at the Georgia Museum of Art, this work. So this is painted in 1769, likely begun in the summer of 1768 by Benjamin West in his studio. And our sitter is a man whose name is Captain Christopher Bethel. And like West, Bethel has a New World connection. Bethel's great-grandfather was one of the founders of the English sugar-producing colony on Barbados. His grandfather and his great-uncle held public office on the island of Barbados. But as you know, Barbados is an island. And the way that inheritance worked in British families, land inheritance, it often went to the eldest son. And so if you were the third son or the fourth son, and over a couple generations, all of the land on Barbados had been divvied up. So there was no wealth to be had for future generations, especially second, third, fourth sons. And it's either Captain Bethel's grandfather or his father that moves back to England in the early 1700s. His father is a baronet in England. And in order to seek his fortune, Captain Bethel, he ends up serving in the Royal Navy, in the British Navy. We have him seated in Benjamin West's studio just about the same time as his 40th birthday in 1768. It's also the year that he gets married for the first time. So we don't know whether he sat for West for this portrait because of the momentous birthday, the 40th birthday, or in recognition of his marriage. It's likely because of his marriage in 1768. We get this wonderful portrait by West, who becomes head of the Royal Academy in London and stays there for the rest of his career. There's 1 year where he resigns from being president of the Royal Academy, but he takes it right back up 12 months later. As president of the Royal Academy from prior to the Revolutionary War all the way until 1820, he ends up teaching several generations of American artists who go abroad and study at the Royal Academy. One of those artists is Samuel Morse, and another one is the focus of our talk here today, Charles Byrd King. So West is the father of that little story. And in 1805, Charles Byrd King goes to London to study at the Royal Academy under Benjamin West. Charles Byrd King had been born in Newport, Rhode Island. Wanted to be an artist, moved to New York, and began under the tutelage of Edward Savage in Manhattan, in New York, before realizing that to make any kind of professional career, and as we'll find out, Charles Byrd King was very business savvy. In order to make any kind of professional career, he knew he needed to go to Europe, and did so and studied with West at the Royal Academy in London from 1805. And really, he stayed in London until the opening of the War of 1812. So he was there from 1805 until 1812, when the war brought him back to the United States. He goes to New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and eventually ends up in Washington, D.C., where he has a studio from the 18-teens until he passes away in 1862. So really, for 5 decades, Charles Byrd King had a studio in Washington, D.C. And as a result of that studio in D.C. and his business savvy, he ingratiated himself to American elite. And he made sure that anybody who was anybody in the District of Columbia ended up in his studio. And the list becomes an amazing list. You talk about presidents and first ladies, U.S. senators, congressmen, visiting foreign dignitaries, cabinet secretaries, anybody who was anybody. Over those 5 decades, King made sure they ended up in his studio to have their portrait painted. In 1823, the man who sat for this portrait, William Harris Crawford, was Secretary of the Treasury, working for President Monroe. sat in King's studio for this portrait and for another portrait that we'll look at here in PowerPoint in just a minute. What makes King famous, however, is that he ends up getting a government commission from the bureau that would eventually become the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where the bureau hired him to paint portraits of every visiting American Indian dignitary who came to the District of Columbia for official business. The Bureau of Indian Affairs made sure they ended up in King's studio when he painted their portrait. Those portraits became published in a book, which was widely circulated among American middle-class families. It was a very popular book. They were circulated as lithographs as part of that history of American Indians. And that's what made King famous as far as the general American public. I pulled up for you a couple of images of, as we talk about them all the time when we talk about this painting, but I never really showed images. I pulled up some images of some of King's American Indian portraits. This is one of a leader of the Pawnee, whose name I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. And it's a portrait that is in the Smithsonian's collection to this day. Dates to 1823, 1822, about the exact same year as William Harris Crawford here. Then many of them are in Western collections. So museums out west, where it would make sense that since a lot of these American Indian peoples were Western peoples, that these portraits have made it out into Western collections. And these are two portraits that are in the collection of the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The one below is the brother of Tecumseh, the prophet. Yes. And so they've got these two wonderful portraits by Charles Byrd King in their collection out in Tulsa at the Gilcrease. That's right. Absolutely. And so these are the types of images that made King famous with the American public, because they saw them reproduced in lithograph form in published books. And it was that federal commission that got him well known. Most of those portraits ended up, because they were done for the federal government, ended up in government collections. And this is a print showing the picture gallery at the new Smithsonian Institution in 1858, where mixed in with other images, other portraits by John McStanley and several other artists, many of these American Indian portraits went on display at the Smithsonian in 1858. So they make up that whole wide range salon hang of portraits that you see there in the background here in this print of the Smithsonian. I have seen a copy of the book, yes.
Is there one here?
There is not one here, no.
The Harvard does.
Yes,
The
the Harvard does.
And they're displayed now in the Harvard.
Yeah, I think they are.
1850.
1858 was this print, showing the picture gallery at the Smithsonian. So our sitter, William Harris Crawford, in 1823 sat for two portraits. One of them is right here in front of you. The other belongs to the Redwood Library in Rhode Island. Charles Byrd King, having been from Newport, Rhode Island, gave his archives and many works of art to the Redwood Library. Their portrait, you notice, is well, I guess it's a little bit longer than half length, about a 2/3 length portrait of Crawford seated in a chair, whereas ours is simply the bust length portrait. So we've got sister paintings here, essentially, but both done on site in 1823. It's likely our painting was done initially, and then the extended version, which ended up at the Redwood Library, was done afterwards, perhaps not even with Crawford sitting for it anymore, whereas this one would have been a study for that. That's likely the case.
And would Crawford have paid for these himself?
I imagine Crawford probably would have paid for the bust length one. That one King kept for himself for whatever reason. And I don't really know the Providence. The Providence histories on both of these don't go back very far. That one, as far as that one came right from King to the Redwood Library. So what King did with it in the interceding years from 1823 until his death in 1862, that's not really documented. You'll notice looking at our portrait of William Harris Crawford, 1823, as well as that Redwood Library one, There's the feel which our artist Charles Burt King would have been steeped in of English Regency portraiture, that Romantic era portraiture. I just give you one example among dozens upon dozens that I could have pulled up. This is an English poet, Burns, done by a Scottish artist. It's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. The hairstyle, in particular with Charles Burt King, those wonderful curls that you get on King's hair there. But this idea that there feels to be this sort of flourish in the way that these are painted, and that idea of that flourish, that romantic flourish coming through, was something which had been typical of Regency portraiture, which King would have seen again and again and again during his 7 years in London, and would have been applying to these portraits that he was creating back in Washington, D.C. in the 1820s. Now we'll get to our sitter, William Harris Crawford. Crawford, as I mentioned, in 1823, was Secretary of the Treasury working for President Monroe. But he had already had a long political history before ending up as Secretary of the Treasury in 1823.
How about you?
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, that's what
When did you get here?
I was late. I thought it was at 2:30.
Well, I've already got 3 pages of notes. Y'all, this is a descendant of William H. Crawford, Ames we've done. Paul Manoguerra. And this is about this.
Crawford had been born in Virginia and has moved with his family initially to Edgefield, South Carolina, and eventually, especially during the Revolutionary War, where those families who were with the Continental Army were pushed by Royalists into North Georgia and into the North Georgia frontier at that point. He was about 14 years old when that took place, and they moved to the region of North Georgia. He studies in multiple secondary schools. Also ends up being a teacher at those secondary schools before becoming a lawyer and sitting for the bar in his late teens. And works as a lawyer in what was then Lexington, Georgia, in the region of Oglethorpe County. During that time period, he became deeply involved in politics. He hated the idea of corruption and bribery, and in particular growing out of the Yazoo land deal, and was very vocal to the point where he ended up creating political enemies. And those political enemies, in fact, led him into 2 duels that he had. One where he ends up mortally wounding a political opponent, and the other where he gets wounded by a descendant of Elijah Clark in the hand. And that wounding simply settled the duel. But they had come to that agreement that it wasn't in fact going to be to the death if it still worked itself out. But he had political enemies throughout his life because of his adversarial relationship to the cronyism and bribery that was involved in that Yazoo land deal. But that was how he got involved in politics. He got elected to the Georgia legislature. And back when, in the days before the direct election of U.S. senators, like we have today, it was the General Assemblies, the state legislatures of the given states that elected the 2 U.S. senators from that given state to go to Washington, D.C. to represent the state in the U.S. Senate. And on the death of Abraham Baldwin, U.S. Senator from Georgia, the Georgia General Assembly elected William H. Crawford as U.S. Senator from Georgia. So he goes to Washington, D.C. Eventually, in the U.S. Senate, he serves as, at what that point would have been the youngest president pro tempore of the U.S. Senate. Serves as U.S. Secretary of War, serves as Minister to France for President Madison, is involved in the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in 1815 that ends the War of 1812, during this time that he's Minister to France. Comes back and eventually serves President Monroe as Secretary of the Treasury, which is what his position was when he sat for King in King's D.C. studio for this portrait in 1823, Secretary of the Treasury. Now I ask this question, and some people may actually know the answer for once. Because usually when I ask this question, nobody knows the answer. I said, are you at all versed on your 1824 presidential election history? No, most of the time it's no, but I've got a few people who might say yes here. But we'll go through it anyway. Now, the presidential election of 1820, I put the Electoral College map up here for you. President Monroe, eventually President Monroe, James Monroe, in the November 1820 election, wins what, looking at the Electoral College, is a complete and utter landslide. It makes any landslide in the contemporary era look ridiculous to even be called a landslide when we look at the Electoral College here. And he beats John Quincy Adams in that election. And the 1820 election is really the last election where we have, for a little while, the two original parties, the Federalist, Anti-Federalist, the Jeffersonian Democrats, and that two-party system that comes out of the Revolution dissolves with the 1820 election. And after the 1820 election, it goes away during the presidency of Monroe, during the time that Crawford was serving as Secretary of the Treasury. So by the time we get to the November 1824 election, our Electoral College map looks very different. The two-party system has been completely blown up. And in fact, we have four major presidential candidates in November of 1824. The old Republican Party, and this is the old Republican Party now that we're talking about, in caucus decides that William H. Crawford is their candidate for the presidency. But because of all of these backroom dealings and bribery cases and everything else going on in the government at the time, there's some suspicion about that, and it stays with Crawford for part of the presidential election. That combined with the unfortunate illness that hits Crawford during the run-up to the November 1824 election that prevents him from campaigning for himself, leads to him being less than successful, as the 1824 map shows you here. The other three presidential candidates in 1824, John Quincy Adams, coming back from 1820. Particularly strong, as you'll notice there in the Northeast. The person who wins the largest amount of the popular vote is the U.S. Senator from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson. Also involved in this presidential election is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who is already at this point an adversary, a strong adversary of Andrew Jackson. So all of that chaos in the November of 1824 election leads to what the map shows you here. William Harris Crawford, our man in this painting by Charles Bird King, ends up winning the states of Virginia and Georgia, where he gets all of the Electoral College votes from those two states. As well as you notice that he wins Electoral College votes in a couple other places. He wins 5 in New York, and he wins 2 in Delaware. Meanwhile, John Quincy Adams ends up with 32% of the Electoral College vote and 84 electoral votes. Henry Clay ends up with 37 electoral votes, and John Quincy Adams with a big chunk there. Well, I mean, Andrew Jackson with 99 electoral votes. So if you're simply going on the plurality, Andrew Jackson should have been President of the United States in November 1824. But unfortunately for Andrew Jackson, the Constitution isn't set up that way. In order to be President of the United States, if you'll remember from your civics classes, the Constitution says that you must win a majority of the Electoral College. If no one candidate wins the majority of the Electoral College, the vote gets kicked to the U.S. House of Representatives. And of course, it just so happens that the Speaker of the House of Representatives is one of our presidential candidates here, who is an adversary of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, the leading popular vote in Electoral College game. So, the vote gets kicked to the House of Representatives. This is an image from the National Archives of the handwritten document. It's really hard to see, of course, here, even in PowerPoint. I invite you to go to the website and take a look at it, which tallies up the votes in the House of Representatives. What ends up happening is in the House, John Quincy Adams, who has this core of voters in the Northeast, and Henry Clay, who has very little Electoral College support, but still has a lot of sway in the Trans-Appalachian West, in particular people who are also adversarial to Andrew Jackson. They form a coalition where Clay makes sure that he throws enough support from the Trans-Appalachian West behind Adams that gets Adams elected President of the United States. He wins the House of Representative votes. What it turns out happening, this is a document that's in the Library of Congress, what Andrew Jackson's supporters end up calling the corrupt bargain was that Adams, in order to get Clay's support, promises Clay the position of Secretary of State, which, unlike Vice President in its day, was viewed as the stepping stone to presidency. John Quincy Adams had been President Monroe's Secretary of State at the same time that Crawford was Secretary of the Treasury. They served in the same cabinet for President Monroe. Jackson's supporters call this a corrupt bargain. It's just another example, another evidence of government officials doing for their own and making these backroom shady deals. Jackson throws a fit, quits the U.S. Senate, goes back home to Tennessee, and immediately begins, on the day that this vote takes place in the U.S. House of Representatives, immediately begins his campaign against Adams for the 1828 election, which of course Jackson will eventually win as an anti-government Jacksonian Democrat. So this is a document signed by John Quincy Adams, which nominates officially Henry Clay as Secretary of State, and it's in the Library of Congress collection. So I thought I'd pull that out for you as well. So there's all that chaos going on related to the November 1824 election. So in all of it, William Harris Crawford, in the eventual vote, ends up finishing third in the House of Representatives for President of the United States in November 1824. He ends up serving President Monroe and then President Adams as Secretary of the Treasury before moving back to North Georgia and serving as a U.S. Federal Circuit Court judge here in North Georgia, which is what he continues to do while being involved in politics, both local and national politics, for the rest of his career. Crawford, sitting on the bench in Elberton in 1834, believes that his new buddy, Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, is going to be appointing Crawford to the U.S. Supreme Court. He believes that appointment is coming. He believes Jackson's going to nominate him for the U.S. Supreme Court. When Crawford takes ill and dies in 1834 in Elberton. And we don't know for a fact whether or not Jackson ever intended that Supreme Court nomination, but Crawford died believing it was coming. Now, we like to talk a lot about these connections. Charles Bird King ends up in Washington, D.C. serving as mentor, as teacher to the artist of the portrait directly next to him, George Cook, who has his own Athens stories and Athens connections as well. In fact, it's in Athens where this portrait that's adjacent is painted. So we've got all these wonderful chain of events of mentor, artist, becoming mentor to another artist, but then they have Athens connection. We're also especially proud of paintings that tell all these national stories that, of course, have local connections. And the Crawford one has an even greater significant local connection. Of course, if you drive on US 78 out of Athens, headed toward Lexington, headed toward Augusta, you come to the one stoplight town named for William Harris Crawford, the sitter of this portrait. Crawford, Georgia. There's the city limit sign. I took this 2 days ago on that nice sunny day that we had. As you're coming up to the city of Crawford, you come to the road now named for William Harris Crawford, which is it's still a dirt road, which leads back to where his grave is. But what also would have been the site of Woodlawn, where his home had been located in Oglethorpe County. So there's the street sign. You turn left there off of US 78. There's this wonderful marker there as well, put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution here in Clark County for William Harris Crawford. And then the official historical marker, which points the arrow back, as well as gives you some of this historical information I've already given you. Gives you the arrow back, telling you that about 150 yards in that direction, you'll find the ground where the homestead was, wood lawn, as well as the grave. So I'll just take you, since I did it on one day, I'll take you through it as well. There's the dirt road that gives you back to the grave site. You've got this wonderful, it's nicely cleaned up. Somebody's been taking care of it.
Yeah.
It was very clear somebody's been taking care of it. You've got the wonderful southern magnolia that's inside of it there. And back there in the left-hand corner, there's a detail of magnolia too. Back in the back corner is William Harris Crawford's grave, which has this wonderful inscription. It's a beautiful inscription. So, sacred to the memory of William Harris Crawford, born the 24th of February, 1772 in Nelson County, Virginia, died 15th of September, 1834 in Oak Grove County, Georgia. In the legislature of Georgia and the Senate of the United States, as minister to the court of France, in the cabinet and on the bench, he was alike independent, energetic, fearless, and able. He died as he had lived in the service of his country, and left behind him the unimpeached fame of an honest man. So part of his own myth-making about himself throughout his career was that he was, in spite of all of these political appointments, was anti-establishment. That he was against all of these sorts of corrupt bargains that got John Quincy Adams the presidency to begin with. Those sorts of backroom government dealings, under the table sorts of things, were the kinds of ideas that he constantly positioned himself against throughout his life. And so you see even on his grave, he establishes himself in that way. His family establishes himself in that way. And it's a wonderful legacy. So it's just one of those great examples, among many here in the collection of the Georgia Museum of Art, of a painting that tells this national story. Tells of this 1824 election, this transition from one political party movement to another political party movement, the rise of the Jacksonian era and Jacksonian democracy, Crawford's role in all of that, but then has this very specific, wonderful local connection. And so we're really proud of paintings like that, and I really today just wanted to highlight this painting. I'm particularly proud that this painting came into the collection just a few years ago, thanks to our collectors group here at the museum, putting up the money, allowing the museum to purchase this work of art, for it to be here. It's an important painting. It's important that it's here. Arguably the most significant antebellum American portrait painter in Charles Bird King, and then we get the fact that it's a Georgia sitter with that whole local connection. Questions?
Yes, I just want to say, this is the best talk.
Thank you.
Just that.
Questions or comments at all? Especially from the family.
Great.
You know, that somebody is doing a wonderful job cleaning it up out there. I'm glad.
I wasn't always the case.
Yeah, Chris was fun to me.
Can we get a DVD to send these down?
I would imagine we could.
That would
Release some digital copies.
Yeah, people.
Questions or comments at all?
I thought you included looking at the grave at Sun, and I've driven to that, and I've driven by it for many, many years, and it's so great to...
Me too. I had been meaning to take these pictures for a long time, and this was my excuse to finally do it.
stops there, but it's just nice to make a connection.
It was interesting what you said about provenance, and that, how did y'all find out that this was available?
It ended up being for sale at a retail gallery in Charleston Renaissance Gallery, in Rob Hickman. I saw it for sale there as we were beginning to think about how to spend the collector's money. And so I went in person and took a look at the painting in person, and we blacklit it and just looked at the condition and all those sorts of issues. He discovered it through a New York art historian who found it at an estate sale in upstate New York. And what we don't know is how it ended up there. And so the trail from King until then goes cold. But because of its deep resemblance to the Redwood Library work, and the fact that it's a bust length that would have been typical of most of the portraits, stylistically, and so much original paint there when we blacklit it, that it just became important. So it doesn't have a solid provenance going back to King, but
Yeah.
stylistically, connoisseurship and everything else, there seems to be little doubt that it's Charles Bird King.
Have you ever seen the other portrait?
I haven't, but that picture is actually, I tried to get on the Redwood site, and they have probably 20 or 30 portraits, but
They
that
do.
one is not on the,
Well, it is now, because that's where I pulled it from. It's from their website, which is how they got their little watermark over right across it. So they do have it on the website now.
apparently the guy that Hickling got it from was recognized it.
Yes, because of that one, right. Yeah, that was what Rob told me.
Because it's not signed. Is there anything on the back?
There's quite a bit of information on the stretcher and on the back.
Oh, there is?
There is.
Like what? I mean, what?
Just the date and the sitter.
Oh.
And then some, if I remember right, some stickers referencing New York Frame Shop, as well as a stamp referencing where the canvas had been purchased, which was an art supply shop in New York. So I think those stamps are back there too, which help as well.
Do you think it would have been commissioned by the sitter? I mean, just what you believe?
Probably. I think King may have had some sway. And the idea of sitting for King probably would have mattered. I mean, just a year later, John Quincy Adams, the First Lady, ends up sitting for Charles Bird King. So, I mean, it really is a who's who that ends up in King's studio. So Crawford would have been running into King in the social scene there within the District of Columbia anyways. So who applied the pressure on whom, I don't know. Whether it's King saying you need to come sit, or Crawford getting the idea to sit. I don't know which way that worked, but it would have been necessary for Crawford at some point to end up in King's studio, just as part of the conversation of being in those same social circles.
You don't have any knowledge of how many of, say, Monroe's cabinet would have sat for King?
No, I don't. I haven't gone through to see if we can count up the number of people during the 1820s in the two cabinets of both Monroe and Adams cabinet, and then end up sitting. But it's quite a few.
Yeah.
You know, they have records of
Right, all of Charles Bird
Charles
King's.
Peale.
Oh, sure.
Had records of all the paintings.
Sure.
He painted it. I'm just going to laugh, but
Right.
he painted a copy, or offered to paint a copy. I can't remember for it. So I don't know that he actually ever bought it. He may not have.
No, right, which is why the larger version probably stayed with King throughout King's life and career, and how it ends up in the Redwood Library when King donates all of his art that's left with him, as well as his archives, his personal papers to the Redwood Library. That's probably how that larger painting ends up there.
I'm just trying to get that. Sure, the names weren't that expensive. It may have been other reasons, but that's in Charles Wilson's diary.
Sure.
Diary response.
Sure. Peel may have been too expensive at that point
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
with his name. Yeah.
Wonder what the difference would have been. Do you have any idea what Charles Bird King would charge?
No, I don't.
And,
Although all that information is probably in the archives at the Redwood Library.
Yeah.
All of his
and
financial transactions are
the
probably
other
there.
thing was that James McKinney's records, because he's the one who had the King and all those images.
Right,
You
yes.
might know from that.
We do, and actually on the Library of Congress website, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, there's a document. I don't remember the dollar figure. I think it was, yeah, I mean, when I'm speculating, they do say on that website there, but it's not as large of a dollar figure as you would imagine.
Yeah. And it might have got a break for them because they were just constantly sending those images.
Right, it's part of the deal.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the year he got a stroke. Do they know when it was painted that year?
Yeah, it would have been, because it would have been 1824 that he had the stroke, leading up to the presidential election. So
Yeah.
this predates that.
We could speak if they wanted to speak. Be a great story about where he was elected to the presidency.
Absolutely. Would have been.
His daughter was the secretary at the time. probably working on some letters.
It was a debilitating illness for a little while.
What does your daddy have? You mentioned clothes. Didn't he have clothes?
And the only thing he had left was when he was younger, they had a suit that he wore to minister to France. He used to play in it. Because it was embroidered, gold-embroidered suits. They gave that to the state, and I think that's in the archives I've never seen. And they have a secretary, Jim, was a secretary. They say that one of the doctors drafted on, but I don't know that there's a and what else? We had letters. I think those are all, we've got a few of them in the Georgia Historical Society. We had Adams's letter asking him to remain on the Secretary of Treasury, and his response, fine, the way to the bank, and they said deposit box. Dad lost one of the letters.
Oh my.
Just left it on his
Just
car seat.
fell out of the envelope or something. So he said one of his response. It was a nice response. It was nice to put together.
Yeah.
That's about it. Kirkland. Tiebacks for Kirkland.
From Woodlawn.
Yeah, and gave it to us when she was a young girl. She went into the house and just took it. The house was
Yeah,
in bad shape.
And Woodlawn was demolished when?
It just fell down.
It just fell down.
Yeah, it might have burned that in, but it wasn't all that long ago. I mean, my father talked about seeing it when he was young. But even then, I think it was in bad shape.
My great-great-grandfather, before he had all of his papers, he was writing a book on it. And they had everything. And it burned in the House of Americas. I think the Civil War in the century. So there's, that's one of the reasons why there's so little,
There hasn't been enough
information on it. Because the collections are all kind of spread out everywhere. It's just a comprehensive set of this.
Sure.
It's a real shame.
Yeah.
There are no person, I've never seen a personal letter of this. He to his children, right?
You don't remember, did he go to Moses Waddell's school?
He did.
He
For a
did?
while, yes.
Ah, that's great.
And that was where he met John C. Calhoun.
Yeah, and was that the one at Wellington over in South Carolina, just across the river?
Yes, I think so.
Talk Calvin.
I think he did one of the teachers there for a period of time, and then he was at, I remember the name of the Academy in Augusta. He was there for a little while.
Richmond Academy.
He taught English down there for a little while before working on his law degree.
You know, it's so interesting. I mean, I think if people just collected all of the jewels they were all in, that would be so interesting. Because he was the second to a jewel. Charles Tate.
Right.
He was Judge Tate's second. And Judge Tate was jeweling John Dewey. And his second was John Clark, Elijah's son.
Right.
So,
Yeah, they weren't getting along with those landowners.
yeah. And also, you know, it wasn't just the Yazoo, but
Part of the federalism.
that too, but also Elijah Clark was going to establish his own government. It's called the Trans-Oconee. And Washington had to threaten to send troops down
Sure.
to
It was all very
give it
complicated.
up.
Virginians in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Those two parties were the main parties in Georgia. The Virginians and the
Well, great. Thank you.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you.